Hello everyone, this is Tanner here with AJ Aircraft, continuing on with the 51-inch baby slick build. I apologize for the long hiatus. I recently moved out of state and it took me a few months to get settled in and get this aircraft here in my new home. But anyways, we're gonna continue on. In my last video I showed you how to mount the landing gear, both the main gears and the tail wheel. We're gonna go ahead and hinge up the rudder, which means we can connect the tiller arm to the bottom of the rudder finally with the provided screw right there. To start off, we're going to need a few things. Obviously, first of all, we're going to need some thin CA. This is Bob Smith Industries Instacure, basically sticky water. So for those of you not experienced with thin CA, this stuff is extremely runny. As you can see in the bottle there, it's just looks like water. But anyways, I like to use precision drippers. These help control the flow of CA so you don't dump a ton everywhere. It helps you really get up close to the gluing surface. Let me get one out here. As you can see, it's got a very fine tip on it. It helps with application. You can also store quite a bit in here. This goes quite a ways. In fact, I'll probably be able to do all of the hinges with just filling this halfway. But anyways, this is the part number. BSI 321 regular tip. I got these off of Amazon. These are kind of expensive. They're $8 for this 3-pack. They can save you a bunch of time. They can save you glue, so you're not dumping it everywhere. If you're lucky, you can reuse it. If you clean this out with some rubbing alcohol when you're done, get it thoroughly cleaned out, let it dry out, you can usually reuse them. So good to have. I do a lot of building with these, so it's worth it to me to buy some, especially for foam airplanes or small areas where you need to really be precise with your CA application. We're gonna need an X-Acto blade with some fresh sharp blades. You want this to be sharp because we will be cutting some covering. I know it can be a little bit scary doing that. Just make sure you have a sharp blade, take your time, and you will be able to do it really cleanly. We have to cut out the slot for the horizontal stab. It's right in here. We'll go ahead and show you where that is, because in order to hinge up the horizontal stab, we need to glue the horizontal stab to the fuselage. So I'll go ahead and show you how to do that in this video. Just an old credit card or Speedy Rewards membership card, really any kind of card, to help set the gap between the hinge, between your surface and your flying surface. That definitely helps, so that way you don't wind up with big giant unnecessary gaps or set it too tight, which prevents you from getting full control throw. Lastly, some sandpaper. This is for roughing up the joiner on the horizontal stab, this guy right here, because you do have to glue it into the stab for the port side of the airplane. That is the left side of the airplane when you're looking from the canopy towards the propeller. You're gonna need some blue masking tape here, because we will have to do some cutting into the covering on this guy to expose the bare wood to help with adhesion into the fuselage. Okay, first up we're going to do the wings, because these are going to be the easiest to do. Mine came with the ailerons already set in place, but as you can see, they are not actually glued. The hinge is, or rather seems to be, glued into the control surface itself. But it's not going to matter, because we're going to drip thin CA in there. We're going to make sure it's really bonded. So first thing you really want to do is take a little bit of time using your credit card or other small, slim device, just to make sure that this gap is set as tight as you can possibly get it without restricting the movement of the surface. So you want to get this in here until it fits relatively tight. And then again, you also want to line up the inside of the aileron so that It's relatively parallel with this extension on the wing here. You don't want that gap to be terribly huge. You don't want this part of the surface sticking out further from here, so you want this all to be relatively parallel. So as you can see here, I've kind of already semi-set this wing up, ready to go, so it's relatively parallel and ready to get glued here. Same thing out at the tip. As you can see, it's relatively squared up with the tip of the wing. We're going to go ahead and fill up our little precision dripper here. As you can see, I filled it up about halfway. All you got to do to fill this guy up is unscrew the cap on your bottle of thin CA. You want to be really careful here, because again, this stuff is like water. It'll get everywhere, and before you know it, you've bonded something to something else that shouldn't be bonded. Sure, plenty of us have had experience with that. For the new people, you really don't want to know what that's like. It's a terrible thing to have happen to you while you're trying to enjoy building your airplane. So anyways, to fill this guy, squeeze the base here, the large bubble part, just squeeze it in, dip the tip down inside your CA, and let go. And it will start drawing the CA up inside of the dripper. I'm not going to need much more than that. That's plenty of thin CA to get this job done. So I'm going to go ahead and double check my alignment here. Again, use your credit card or other tool to make sure that the hinge gap is set relatively evenly throughout the surface. You don't want an excessively large gap to let too much air through. That'll ruin performance. But again, you don't want the gap to be so tight that you're only getting minimal control throw out of it. You want to be able to maximize it as much as you can possibly go. So I'm going to go ahead and get this set up, and then we'll go ahead and get it glued in. All right, once you've got this set up and you're happy with how the hinge gap is, all you do is take your precision dripper, and I'm going to see if I can catch this on film because I'm not watching my screen right now. I'm watching what I'm doing. So let's see. That's probably good. Take your dripper over the hinge. Just drop 1, 2, and that's actually probably plenty of CA. Just go ahead and do that for each of the hinges. On this airplane, there is 4 hinges on the aileron. There's one here, there's one there, there's one all the way out at the tip. So go ahead and put 2 drops on the top of the hinges. Go ahead and flip your entire wing over, and then do 2 more drops on the bottom, and let the CA cure up on its own. You do not want to use accelerator on this part because it will make the CA crystallize, and it will actually crack, and it may not actually seep into the wood inside. The whole idea is to get the CA to wick into the fibers of both the wood and the hinge so that they bond together and become one part, basically. That's the whole idea here. So I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of this, and then I'm going to flip it over and do the other side, and then wash, rinse, and repeat. Do that for the other wing panel. Okay, both surfaces all hinged up. These are nice and tight in there. They're not going to come out. I'm pulling out on it right now. I know it's hard to tell with just one hand, but these aren't going to come out. They're going to stay in there pretty firmly no matter how aggressively you fly. As you can see, I get quite a lot of throw out of it. There's no binding or restrictions in there. So it's gonna fly amazing. I'm gonna have tons of authority in the air. The servos are gonna be fighting the control surface as far as aerodynamic loads go, and that's what you do want. You don't want your servo fighting your hinge as well as having to push the surface while it's flying. That just causes excess current draw on the servo, and that can actually wind up making your servo fail prematurely. That's obviously a bad idea while you're flying the airplane, especially if the surface happens, or your servo happens to fail in an undesirable position, like full up aileron. That would be really horrible. I've seen that happen before, and believe me, that's tough to get out of. But the wings are done as far as hinging, so I'm gonna go ahead and move on to getting the fuselage set up for the horizontal stab. Okay, this is everything we're going to need to do the horizontal stabs, or excuse me, stab, and then get the elevators glued into it, hinged up. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to cut out this slot in the tail. If you shine a flashlight through, a really bright flashlight through the other side, you can kind of see the outline. Otherwise, if you press on it, you can see where the wood opens up, and once you get your knife in there, you'll be able to see it a lot better. Make sure you have a razor sharp knife. This blade's pretty good. I believe it should do the job. It's not been used. Make sure you have plenty of sharp ones, because after you make a handful of cuts into the covering, it'll start to dull the blade. I'm going to go ahead and cut out the rear section here. And then something that we're going to have to do at some point eventually is cut out the holes in the front here. But right now is a good time to do it, because the best way to get this elevator squared up in the rear of the airplane is by putting the wings on. So we're going to go ahead and get the hole cut out for the wing tube. You can see the phenolic runs through here, but there's no hole in the covering. That's where it would go. There's also a couple holes for the pins, for the anti-rotation pins in the wing. There's one right there, and there's one up here. When you get the hole cut for the wing tube, you can kind of push the wing on and then see where the anti-rotation pins will go, and kind of push it in a little bit. It'll get some indentations going in the covering that'll make it easy to cut out. So I'm going to go ahead and start cutting all these holes out, these holes in the back on both sides, and as well as the holes up here on the front of the fuselage, again on both sides. All right, just a little quick tip. You don't have to do this necessarily, but this does help. You're gonna want to iron the covering down around these holes to help it stick down while you're cutting it, so that it doesn't peel up. Sometimes especially after these things sit in a container for a while, the covering can get loose. This is a normal thing as the aircraft acclimates to its environment. So you definitely are going to want to go over it with a covering iron at some point, but you really do want to hit these areas before you start cutting into it. Same thing up front with all the holes. That way the covering stays adhered down while you're cutting and doesn't wind up peeling up or do funny things when you're slicing through it, which could potentially make a bit of a mess. So I got my covering iron set to right between 2 to 3. I don't know what temperature that is. Every iron's going to be a little bit different. But you just want it hot enough to get the covering hot so that the adhesive on the back side of it melts and helps it stick down. You don't want it so hot that you cause the covering to start warping and peeling away, especially with multiple layers of covering. The blue covering is on the bottom, the yellow and red are on top, and as well as the white is also on top of the blue. So just go ahead and iron down these areas real quick. You don't have to iron the whole airplane right now. We'll worry about that once it's been outside and flown a bunch. Okay, so as you can see, I've got the hole for the wing tube cut out. I've already done the port side of the aircraft. That is the left side as you're sitting in it, looking towards the front of the airplane. We're going to go ahead and do the right side, and this is what I was talking about with getting these little anti-rotation pinholes located, is just slide the wing panel on and look inside, kind of make sure you're going to the right place. As you can see in here, there is a hole for the anti-rotation pin in the composite material, in the carbon Kevlar. There's also one back here as well. Might be a little hard to see, but just eyeball it. That'll get you kind of in the range. And then what you do from here is you'll actually push the wing all the way up against the fuselage and just gently push in on it. You don't want to force it through, although I guess you could, but that might cause damage. I prefer to stick to my way. That way we keep everything damage free. So go ahead and just push it against the fuselage. And if you look in here, you can actually see the anti-rotation pin pushing into the covering a little bit. Go ahead and I'm going to push it in a little firm here to make an indentation, and if I pull it back out, you can see we have a small dent in the covering. Same thing for back here, a little tiny dent, might be hard to see on camera, but I can see where it is. So then go ahead and pull the wing off, and we'll go ahead and cut those out. Okay, and as you can see, we have 3 holes here, actually, because I did cut out the hole for the wing bolt. That's where you thread the wing bolt in. It's a nice little wing bolt. I went over the holes with an iron just to make sure the covering's all sealed. Then I cut them out, and then I ran the iron over them one more time. These aren't going to be the prettiest holes. They're kind of difficult to cut out, given that they have a very small diameter. So just do your best. Make sure you have a sharp hobby knife, and don't worry if they don't come out looking absolutely crisp, because this is just going to get covered up by the wing anyways. Okay, as you can see, we got the wings on. They are both bolted in with the provided wing bolt. This will allow us to move on to getting the horizontal stabilizer squared up into the back of the fuselage. Okay, so first thing I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to run the covering iron over the horizontal stab here. There's going to be a little part that you can't get to once it's glued into the airplane. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure all the covering is ironed down on this. It's already really good, but I'm just going to make sure that it's 100%. Okay, this guy's nice and tight. Real quick to iron down, I'm also going to do the elevators themselves. Like I said before, once they're on, they're on. You won't be able to do this step. So just go ahead and do it now. Save yourself a bunch of time and headache, and most likely eliminate wrinkles in the future. Okay, the next step we're going to do is actually sliding the horizontal stabilizer into the fuselage. I'm going to need 2 hands to do this, so there's going to be some work I'm going to do off camera to get this guy centered up in here. But basically the idea is that once you get this in here and you're relatively certain it's squared up, you're basically going to measure from this tip right here, and you're going to measure out to the tip of the wing. I don't do the tip of the aileron because there may be some variances in the gap in the hinge that could cause this side to be a little bit farther out than the other side of the aircraft. So I'm actually going to measure to this point right here on the actual wing itself. So I'm going to go ahead and get all that squared in there, and then I'll show you how I mark the elevator to get it ready to cut the covering and peel the covering off the inside of the elevator. Alright, first step in the measuring process is to measure this, the outside tip of the horizontal stab, into the edge of the fuselage. Do this on both sides to make sure that the elevator is evenly placed in there in a horizontal plane, so that one side's not sticking out further than the other. And then we can go ahead and measure the tip of the horizontal stab to the tip of the wing over here. Alright, that's just about squared up. You can kind of see it's just about even on both sides. If it is off a tiny bit, probably won't even notice it, but from my measurements it seems to be perfectly square. Not gonna lie, that process kind of sucks to do. It definitely takes some time. You're making little tiny movements side to side on the horizontal stab here, just to make sure that it's the same distance this way as it is this way, and that the leading edge of the tip of the horizontal is the same distance on both sides as it is to the tip of the wing over there on both sides. So this is about squared up, so we're going to go ahead and proceed on to actually gluing it in. This part gets a little bit scary, but take your time and do it right. You won't actually wind up with a big mess. We're going to go ahead and we're going to score the covering here. Now what that means is that you're not actually cutting the covering yet. You're just putting a line into it that runs down this way on both sides, top and the bottom and the left and the right. And then once you have it scored up, the sucky part here is that you actually have to pull the whole assembly back out. And then you cut the covering where you scored it. You take the covering out of the center section. You don't remove this rear section here, so you just cut up to right about there. And then you cut horizontally right there to the other side, and then you just peel around, and that way this part isn't exposed, it's covered up. So we're gonna go ahead and I'm actually gonna score it with the back side of my razor blade here. So I'm not gonna use the sharp cutting side. I'm gonna use the rear side of it, which should leave a nice score line in the covering that I can see when I pull it back out, and then I'll go ahead and cut right there with a sharp razor blade. Don't use a dull one. Don't use one you've already used. Just use a brand new one. It'll make the cut really cleanly, and then you can glue it in from there. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I don't have two hands when I'm filming, so I'm going to do that off camera, and then I'll show you what we've got, and we'll proceed from there. Okay, as you can see, we have some nice score lines on either side of the center here. They go all the way around to the back. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually going to cut into the covering now with again, use a sharp razor blade. Don't use one that you've already used. Even if you've only used it a couple times, just use a sharp one here. You'll thank me later. Okay, can't really tell, but I did actually cut it. Something that'll help you with seeing the score line is just like a flashlight like this. Just hold it in front here. And let me see if I can get this position so that we can actually see what I'm talking about. But just hold it in front here. That way you're not shadowing when you're cutting. So see how you can still see the score line even though you're holding your hobby knife over it. That'll help you visualize where you need to cut. That way you're not making waves in the cut or wandering off center. All right, another tip that'll make life easy is before you peel this covering up, especially since you just freshly ironed it down, it can be kind of tricky to get it to peel up and to get the adhesive to release. So the trick is just to take a covering gun like this, use it on the low setting, don't use it on the high, use it on the low. This way it'll actually heat up and soften the glue underneath what you're trying to peel up, and it won't actually shrink the covering. So even if you heat up the surrounding areas, it shouldn't peel back from your score line. That way you keep a nice tight line, nice and straight, and it gives you a nice clean peel without adhesive sticking to the wood on the inside. And that's actually kind of important because you want a nice wood to wood contact in here. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and do that off camera and I'll show you what we got. Okay, so we've peeled the covering back on both sides of the horizontal stab here. As you can see, I've put some tape right on the lines of the covering, and what I went ahead and did was I took some 220 grit sandpaper and just really lightly scuffed the wood right here. There may be some little adhesive left over from when you peel the covering up, and if you just really lightly scuff it, that'll make a much better surface for the glue to wick into. I put the tape down to help protect the covering so I'm not scratching up the covering. As you can see, it kind of scuffs into the tape. The tape takes the brunt of it and your covering still looks shiny. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to peel this tape back off, and I'm going to put the horizontal stab back in the slot, get it lined up, and we're going to drip some thin CA into there to glue it in. Okay, I got this just about squared back in there how it was before I took it out. So now we're going to go ahead and drip some thin CA into the slots to help glue it in. We're going to drip in from the rear, on the bottom side here and on the top side. And in the front, there's just a tiny slot open that'll let you get thin CA into there. That's all it's really going to need to lock this guy solidly in place. I'm going to use the precision dripper like I've used before to help get it exactly where I want it. A handful of drops in the front and in the back should lock it in place. It won't go anywhere. The thin CA will wick into the wood and expand the fibers, and it basically makes the pieces of wood bond together and form one solid piece of wood. So that's what we're going to go ahead and do here. I'm going to drip that in, and then we'll keep going. Okay, so this bad boy is all glued up in there. I actually didn't even realize it, but up in the top, there's actually a really good place to drip thin CA. There's a good place to make good solid contact in there if you drip it down through there. Again, up in the front, there is a small opening that's just big enough to drip thin CA in there, and it actually wicks in really good. On this, I put a handful of drops on the front on this side and on the back on this side, and then same thing on the other side, and it actually, the wood soaked it up real good. So this is good quality wood that this airplane's built with, as you would expect from an AJ aircraft. So this guy is solidly in there. It's not going to go no matter what. So now we move on to the next step. This is where it's going to get a little bit more tricky, because you actually have to glue the hinges in place as well as glue the stabs to each other. The fitment's actually pretty tight between the joiner and the port side stab, so it shouldn't be too much fuss to get this in there, but I will recommend you use a slow curing glue. I'm actually going to use, of all things, foam tack to glue this together. This is a nice glue that will goop into place, will coat everything thoroughly, and will provide a nice solid and strong bond that will likely outlast the airplane. I wouldn't recommend using CA on this, because you want a glue that's going to take a little bit of time to set up, so you have time to work everything into the right place, because you're kind of doing three different things at once here. You're seating this stab in the right place, you're seating this stab in the right place, and then you're seating this stab to the joiner to join the two stabs together. So again, recommend using a slow curing glue. Epoxy works good. This foam tack is going to work amazing on this, since I don't actually have epoxy. Goop might actually work pretty decently. You want something that's going to cure kind of hard. You don't want something that's going to be a soft, flexible cure. Don't use hot glue on this, especially if you live in a desert climate like I now do. Again, wouldn't recommend CA, because it'll probably set up really quickly and leave you with most likely a surface that's not lined up properly. So first thing we actually got to do is scuff the joiner here. So just take your 220 grit sandpaper and scuff this bad boy up. Make a nice surface for the glue to stick to. And then we'll proceed on with actually gluing. I believe I'm going to glue this side in first, so that it's set, and then we'll go ahead and work on gluing that side in. So let me get this all set up and we'll start gluing. Okay, so these guys are all hinged up. The joiner has been glued in place with some foam tack. Put a generous amount on there and wiped off the excess. So this is going to take about 24 hours to fully cure, so I'll be able to check it, get it all aligned up within about the next hour or so, at which point it will start to set up real strong. Last thing we got to do is just hinge the rudder. That's pretty straightforward. So I'm going to go ahead and get the rudder set on here and lined up. Oh, one thing real quick before we do get onto that. best way I can suggest gluing these elevator halves on here centered is just to make sure your gap between the counterbalance and the horizontal surface is roughly about the same on both sides. Don't go by the covering because sometimes the covering can be off just a little bit, depending on the angle that you look at it. So best thing to do is to go off of this gap as far as I can recommend. Okay, and like I said, last thing to do is just to get the rudder set on here. It's pretty much same procedure for everything else. Just get everything all lined up, especially with the bottom of the airplane. You want this rudder just about flush with the bottom of the fuselage. That'll help get your tiller arm here all set into there. I'm going to go ahead and glue this in. It's just 3 hinges up in there. It might be hard to see from this angle, but gonna set the gap, get it glued in, and that'll pretty much wrap up hinging your airplane. So let me go ahead and do that. All right, last step you got to do is just drill a hole for your tiller arm screw. Make sure to thread it down into the hole and drip some thin CA in after you take the screw back out. That way it'll solidify the threads you just cut into the hole and give the screw a nice solid surface to bite into. Other than that, your airplane is just about ready for servos. All right, this just about concludes hinging your airplane. At this point, like I said, we're ready for servos. Servos I'm going to use are the Hitech D89. It's a fairly new servo to the market. Just came out, I want to say late last year. I have flown a 51-inch AJ Aircraft Slick, this very airplane, with Hitech D89 servos in it, and in my opinion, it flies absolutely astonishing. So I'm going to go ahead and wait for those servos to come in, so it may be some time before my next video comes out, but the next video will most likely be me installing servos and setting up the linkages to the control surfaces. Hope everybody enjoyed this video, and I hope it was an aid to assembling your aircraft. Till then, we'll see you next time.